Oh, here we go. Hello again. Hello again. Give me just a moment to tweet. Here we go. Here we go. What will we read? What will we read? Hold on. Yes, number 2. What shall we read? I forgot who wrote this one. It's called A Collapse of Horses. A Collapse of Horses is what it's called. But let me make one more post. Yes, we're posting to Facebook. So let's do this. Post to Facebook. Spooky story. Then we'll post this. Yes. Oh, my skin suit is itchy along with my skull. Oh. But next, we're going to read A Collapse of Horses. This is by Brian Evanson. About a man with an injury. So, I'm certain nobody in my family survived. I'm certain they burned and that their faces blackened and bubbled just as did my own. But in their case, they didn't recover, but perished. Let's see if I can make this look a little bit better. Here we go. Oh. Oh, there we go. We'll start over. I'm certain that nobody in my family survived. I'm certain they burned and that their faces blackened and bubbled just as did my own. But in their case, they didn't recover, but perished. You're not one of them. You cannot be, for if you were, you'd be dead. Why you choose to pretend to be and what you hope to gain from it, this is what interests me. Now it's your turn to listen to me, to listen to my proofs. Though I know you will not be convinced. Imagine this. Walking through the countryside one day, you come across a paddock. Lying there on their sides in the dust, unnaturally still, are 4 horses. All 4 are prone, with no horses standing. They do not breathe, and they do not, as far as you can see, move. They are, to all appearances, dead. And yet, on the edge of the paddock, not 20 yards distant, a man fills their trough with water. Are the horses alive and appearances deceptive? Has the man simply not yet turned to see that the horses are dead? Or has he been so shaken by what he's seen that he doesn't know what to do but to proceed as if nothing has happened? If you turn and walk hurriedly on, leaving before anything decisive happens, what do the horses become for you? They remain both alive and dead, which makes them not quite alive and not quite dead. And what? In turn, carrying that paradoxical knowledge in your head, what does that make you? I don't think of myself as special as anything but ordinary. I completed a degree at a third-year university housed in the town where I grew up. I graduated safely ensconced in the middle of my class. I found passable employment in the same town. I met a woman, married her, and had kids with her. 3 or perhaps 4. There's some disagreement on the score, yet then 2 of us fell gradually and gently out of love. Ooh. Then came an incident at work, an accident, so-called freak one. It left me with a broken skull and for a short time, a certain amount of confusion. I awoke in an unfamiliar place to find myself strapped down. It seemed to me, I will admit this too, that it seemed for some time, hours at least, perhaps even days, that I was not in the hospital, but in a mental facility. But my wife, faithful and ever present, slowly soothed me in different into a different understanding of my circumstances. My limbs, she insisted, were restrained simply because I'd been delirious. Now that I no longer was, the straps could be loosened. Not quite yet, but soon. There was nothing to worry about. I just had to calm down. Soon, everything would return to normal. In some ways, I suppose everything did, or at least tried to. After the accident, I received some minor compensation from my employer and was sent out to pasture. Such was the situation. Myself, my wife, my children, at the beginning of a hot, sweltering summer, crammed into the house together with nowhere to go. I would awaken each day to find the house different from how it had been the day before. The door was in the wrong place, a window had been stretched a few inches longer than it had been when I had gone to bed the night before. The light switch, I was certain, had been forced half an inch to the right. Always just a small thing, almost nothing at all, just enough for me to notice. In the beginning, I tried to point these changes out to my wife. She seemed puzzled at first, and then she became somewhat evasive in her responses. For a time, part of me believed her responsible. Perhaps she had developed some deft technique for quickly changing and modifying the house. But another part of me, well, felt certain, or nearly so, that this was impossible. And as time went on, my wife's evasiveness took on a certain wariness, even fear. This convinced me that not only was she not changing the house, but that daily her mind simply adjusted to the changed world and dubbed it the same. She just couldn't see the differences that I saw. Just as she could not see that sometimes we had 3 children and sometimes we had 4. No, she could only ever see 3, or perhaps 4. To be honest, I don't remember how many of them she saw. But the point was, as long as we were in the house, there were sometimes 3 children and sometimes 4. But that was due to the idiosyncrasies of the house as well. I would not know how many children there would until I went from room to room. Sometimes the room would end and the hall was narrow and I had 1 bed in it. And other times it had grown large in the night and had 2. I would count the number of beds each morning when I woke up, and sometimes there would be 3, sometimes 4. From there, I could extrapolate how many children I had, and I found this more reliable method than trying to count the children themselves. I would never know how much of a father I was until I counted the beds. I could not discuss this with my wife. When I tried to lay out my proofs to her, she thought I was joking. Quickly, however, she decided this was an indication of a troubled mental state and insisted I seek treatment, which under duress I did, to little avail. The only thing the treatment convinced me of was that there were certain things that one shouldn't say, even to one's spouse. Things that are, well, they're just not ready to hear, and may never be ready to hear. My children, oh, it's got dark, huh? Spooky, spooky. Come on. There we go. My children, they weren't ready for it either. The few times I tried to fulfill my duties as a father and to sit down with them and tell them the sobering truth that sometimes one of them didn't exist, unless it was that sometimes one of them existed twice, I got nowhere, or less than nowhere. Confusion, tears, panic, and after they reported back to my wife, more threats of treatment. What, then, was the truth of the situation? Why was I the only one who could see the house changing? What were my obligations to my family in terms of helping them to understand? How was I to help them if they did not desire to be helped? Being a sensible man, part of me couldn't help but wonder if what I was experiencing had any relation to reality at all. Perhaps there was something wrong with me. Perhaps I tried to believe the accident had changed me. I did try my level best, or nearly so, to see things the way I tried. See things their way. I tried to ignore the lurch in reality every morning. The way the house was not exactly the house that it had been the night before, as if someone had moved us to a similar, but not quite identical home as we slept. Perhaps they had. I tried to believe that I had 3, not 4 children, and they did not work, and that did not work. That I had 4, not 3 children, and when that didn't work, that there was no correlation between children and beds. To turn a blind eye to the room at the end of the hall and the way it kept expanding or collapsing and like a lung, but nothing seemed to work. I could not believe. Ooh. Perhaps if we moved, things would be different. Perhaps the house was in some manner or other alive or haunted, maybe, or just wrong. But when I raised the idea of moving with my wife, she coughed out a strange barking laugh before enumerating all the reasons that was a bad idea. There's no money and little prospect of any coming in now that I had my accident and lost my job. We'd bought the house recently enough that we'd have to take a substantial loss if we sold it. We simply could not afford to move. Besides that, what was wrong with the house? It was a perfectly good house. Not going to argue with this. From her perspective, of course, she was right. There was no reason to leave. For her, there was nothing wrong with the house. How could there be? Houses don't change on their own. She told me indignantly, this was not something that reason would allow. But for me, that was exactly the problem. The house, for reasons I didn't understand, wasn't acting like a house. I spent days thinking, mulling over what to do. To get away from the house, I wandered alone in the countryside. If I walked long enough, I could return home sufficiently exhausted to sleep rather than spending much of the night to watch, to try to capture the moment when the parts of the house changed. For a long time, I thought that might be enough, that if I spent as little time in the house as possible and returned only when exhausted, I could bring myself not to think about how unsound this house was. That I would wake up sufficiently hazy to no longer care what was where and how it differed from before. That might have gone on for some time, even forever or the equivalent, but then in my walks I stumbled on, or perhaps was led to, something. It was a paddock. I saw the horses lying in the dirt, seemingly dead, but they couldn't be dead. Could they? Couldn't? I looked to see if I could tell if they were breathing, and I found I could not. I could not honestly say if they were dead or alive, and I still could not say. I noticed the man on the far side of the paddock filling the trough with water, facing away from them, and wondered if he'd seen the horses behind him, and if not, when he turned, whether or not he would be as unsettled as I was. Would he approach them, him, and determine that they were dead, or would his approach startle them to life, or had he seen them dead already, and his mind had been unable to take it in? For a moment, I waited, but in the time and the moment, there seemed something more terrible to me about the idea of knowing for certain that the horses were dead than there was not knowing whether or not they were dead or alive, and so I hastily left, not realizing that to escape a moment of potential discomfort, I was leaving them forever in my head as not quite dead, but in another sense, nearly alive. That to leave, as I had, was to assert the place of the man beside the trough, and without ever being able to turn and learn the truth. Oh, this is much longer than I thought. And this is really just a test run for the big show tomorrow. So, with that, I am signing off. Gonna take all this skin off my bones and just lay them out. Thank you and good evening.